So welcome, everyone. Whether you have caught every session or this is your first time, we're thankful you took the time to come, and we're glad you are here. First, a little housekeeping. I am Rod Downing. I'm the Zoom host, so send me a note via the chats if you are having an issue. I'm not a guru, but hopefully I'll be able to help. Secondly, we have a Q&A session at one point, so send any questions you have anytime during the session to Dean White, though it can go to everybody if you don't know how to do that. This session marks the start of our series that delves deeper into some chief obstacles. And just transition, that phrase, is one of those obstacles. The oil companies know this is key and thus have taken tremendous distortive efforts to make it that way, to confuse and disorient us. So let's see how. As noted earlier, the concepts are simple. We must transition off fossil fuels, but how we do it is critical. The default, if we don't do anything else, will almost be guaranteed to be unjust. The powerful countries, us and others, have gained much global power through oil use, yet we suffer the least consequences, while poorer countries contributed the least to the problem, but suffer the most. For those of you who've been listening to the news, you've heard about COP29, Conference of the Parties number 29, that was in Azerbaijan and ended yesterday. They spent 2 weeks negotiating specifically on this global aspect of a just transition, whereby we and others, these most powerful countries that have dominated things, would have a fund to help the least developed countries, the ones who are suffering most. It almost fell apart at the end and was really only saved with what I would call a face-saving result. So at the global, even at this global level, this notion of just transition is being discussed, even if it is a muddle and not what the countries need, and so it goes. But back to North America, this is our focus. One example I want to give, though at the end, Andrew will have a longer, definition of just transition and a couple of examples. I'd like to give the example of the oil worker, especially since I'm from Canada and the oil sands or tar sands, of course, has made international news. Well, the company's PR will plaster everywhere that you can't do a transition because it will put the oil workers out of work. So, first point I want to make is beware of the jobs versus transition false choice. Now, it's true, we can't turn off the spigot. We are going to need oil workers especially at the beginning of this transition. So that's not true. We're going to still need oil workers. I'm going to make 4 points where oil workers will still be needed. We also will need their skills for oil drilling, except for geothermal energy. They simply pick up their machinery and drill elsewhere. Third, millions of abandoned oil wells have been left. One of the, I guess you would call it the advantages of being these powerful oil industries is you can simply get your oil, and when it's gone, you leave. So there are these millions of abandoned oil wells, and many leak methane, which is 85 times more potent than CO2. So just think, scattered in numerous places around North America are all of these abandoned oil wells. Well, who can be used to fix them? Oil workers, of course. They have the understanding and the knowledge to do that. That is occurring in a few areas, but not very many. And fourthly, switching jobs to clean tech, where they can relearn skills to retrofit homes and businesses, join solar and wind installations, etc. So that's just a simple snapshot. One industry of oil workers. We could talk about truck drivers, farmers, and so on. They all will be impacted, and we have to make sure that it is not the default, which will be unjust, but rather get policies in place to make it just. So one of the things we can do is talk about these things. That's something that we have had a presentation on, that's one of the greatest gaps, is that we never talk about them. Talking about them in a positive way can counter the distortions and build the political will to create, in the above initiatives, those policies that are needed. You see, building up from our local communities up into that political sphere that, while messy, can, if there is the political will, produce the policies. I'll simply end in my dark days, and I don't have many because I'm an optimist, though a pretty hard-nosed one. I think of how I will view my life. I want to say that I did what I could to be on the side of life and its flourishing. For I know that is aligning with God's good spirit and will be a life of wonderful surprises. For God's spirit ceaselessly coaxes us in that direction. And thus, what better company to be found together with? So, as we make this pivot towards these more gnarly topics, as we dig deeper into the weeds, which we must do, remembering our September session with Stacy Cram, she said hard choices must be made. But it doesn't mean we will have sour, dour faces. It can be full of surprises of finding God's spirit in wonderful places and joining with wonderful people together. And so that is the direction we're heading, but it is one that while we are getting down to some of the, as I say, into some of the weeds, because we must be realistic about things, it is in the end God's Spirit that shall sustain us, surprise us, and help join us together with all those who are trying to align with that spirit of goodness. These themes of the difficult choices ahead and yet the sense of hope will permeate all of the sessions coming up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan to start with the notion of tipping points.
Thank you, Rod, for that excellent introduction to just transition. And as Rod has said, our focus in the coming months will be the imperative to create a just transition. Transition implies, by definition, change. A change from fossil fuels to green energy, from increasing carbon emissions to decreasing all the greenhouse gases. And because we care about the worth and life of all individuals, not just our family and friends, we are advocating for a just transition that will benefit all people, not just the fortunate few who can pay for clean energy easily and want to remain comfortable in consuming energy at an extravagant rate. So let's explore what it is that drives the imperative for a just transition. It's the urgency of the problem. It's the fact that time is running out and we must make some changes. In the last 2 years, global warming has accelerated, and the progressive changes that are occurring in our natural world causing global warming are not predictable, linear increases. What began as gradual changes have accumulated much faster than scientists predicted. We face a climate emergency much worse than it was when we began these webinars 4 years ago, as results escalate toward dangerous horizons called tipping points. Like a chair balanced on 2 legs, it only takes a small nudge to destroy the balance and create collapse. Today we will talk about climate tipping points. A tipping point is a point at which an ecosystem can no longer cope with environmental change, and the ecosystem suddenly shifts from one state to another. And these shifts are almost always negative. The new state usually has less biodiversity and is less productive. During the past year, PBS released a program titled, Has Earth Already Crossed Major Tipping Points? Now, Maya May is the moderator of that, and Tim Lenton is a recognized expert on tipping points who shares some of his observations. Let's view this clip from that video.
Everywhere.
Warming in the ocean tends to find its way out through stronger hurricanes, changes in ocean patterns, coral bleaching, loss of sea ice in the Arctic region. It's all connected.
For much of the last 10,000 years, our planet's climate has been remarkably stable in 3 important ways: temperature, atmospheric carbon dioxide, and sea level. During this time, the human population went from 20 million people on Earth to 8 billion. That stable climate period is what allowed the development of human civilization as we know it. But that stability is gone, and the impacts aren't linear. That's because of tipping points, and these are critical thresholds for our planet that, once crossed, can speed up and intensify the impacts of climate change, and they may not be reversible. How well we understand these changes and how we choose to act will define our future for generations to come.
So Tim, you pioneered the study of climate tipping points almost 20 years ago. So, can you tell me what exactly is a tipping point?
So a tipping point is a threshold in the climate which, if we cross it, we see major accelerating and potentially irreversible change. It really looks like a different world if we cross these climate tipping points. And the decisions we make in the next few years are going to define our climate future. We're talking about the major ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland that together could give us 10 meters of sea level rise. We're talking about major ocean currents that set the pattern of climate for all of us. And then the frozen permafrost of the high Arctic, which as it thaws, it can release twice as much carbon as is currently in the atmosphere. And then there's bits of the living biosphere, the Amazon rainforest and the coral reefs that 500 million people depend on for their livelihoods.
Here's a graphic of Dr. Lenton's list of the 9 potential tipping points that he is concerned about. Notice the boxes that are outlined in blue. There's 4 of them. These 4 tipping points occur because global warming is melting ice in various areas. The Greenland ice sheet, the Arctic sea ice, the West Antarctic ice sheet, and the Wilkes Basin in East Antarctica. Outlined in tan are 2 tipping points related to the increased warming of the ocean, the bleaching and death of coral reefs, and the changes in the speed and direction of the Atlantic currents that circulate the seawater. Now that Atlantic current change affects the marine food change and the creation and intensity of hurricanes and cyclones, but it also affects Europe because the Atlantic current keeps Europe habitable. If it shifts or collapses, Europe will again enter an ice age. Dr. Lenton identifies 2 tipping points related to forest dieback, outlined in green. The Great Amazon rainforest of South America, and the extensive, little publicized boreal forest of Canada, Russia, and subarctic areas. And finally, outlined in purple, the melting of the permafrost across Canada, Russia, and all the Arctic regions. Notice that the permafrost and the coral reefs have stars. Those are the ones we'll deal with today. Other scientists and researchers have published lists of potential tipping points, and they differ. Some have added these tipping points: the melting of mountain glaciers, the die-off of oceanic plankton and krill, changes to the West African monsoon that will impact the Sahel or Sahara region of Africa. A recent report by the IPCC said that some global warming impacts are now unavoidable, even if countries curtail emissions. We're going to explore 2 of these, permafrost and coral reefs. We may be mentioning others during the January to April webinars. Let's look at the characteristics of tipping points. There's a variety of causes of tipping points: geologic causes, human causes, climate change, and some are simply unpredictable. They're small shifts in either human pressures or environmental conditions that can cause large, abrupt changes suddenly, unexpectedly. Tipping points are hard to predict. They're often a surprise. Different ecosystems will have different indicators, and scientists are watching those very closely in different ways. In the oceans, diverse ecosystems ranging from reefs to estuaries to open ocean systems have already in local areas undergone sudden dramatic shifts. When a tipping point is reached, it can often trigger a feedback loop that is unstoppable. Even small changes can trigger feedback loops. For example, tree loss in the Amazon creates a feedback loop where the forest is no longer able to sustain itself, and the result is further dieback. Similar dynamics have been observed with permafrost thaw, melting glaciers, and coral reef death. Feedback loops can amplify or reduce global warming. Let's look at an example of a feedback loop that decreases CO2 and therefore decreases the potential for more warming. This is a positive result, even though we're talking about a decrease, because it's a decrease in global warming. Rocks exposed to the surface interact with water and the atmosphere, and they undergo a set of chemical and physical changes we call weathering. Weathering increases in hotter climates. The chemical part of weathering often involves the consumption of carbonic acid, which is formed from carbon and water. I'm sorry, carbon dioxide and water. And that dissolves the minerals in rocks, which then takes other forms. This process of weathering is thus a sink or a storage area for atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is an important greenhouse gas. So if you remove the carbon dioxide, tie it up, you weaken the greenhouse effect, and that leads to the cooling of the earth. Global warming decreases. It's a slow process, however. This is incremental changes. It is not an answer to global warming, which has many other effects that are accelerating it. Let's look at a different feedback loop that increases the likelihood of greater global warming. This is not an outcome we want, not a positive outcome. Raising global temperatures causes increased, faster permafrost melt. The melting permafrost causes lakes to form that decompose the organic material stored in the soil. Decomposing organic material releases methane. Methane is 85 times more efficient in warming the earth than CO2. So global warming increases, and the cycle goes around and around and around. So let's take a closer look at this major feedback loop that's causing increasing concern among scientists: permafrost. It's not well known, but the implications are enormous, and it's beginning to make the news. The video uses the term yedema in the video clip from the PBS show. Yedema to refer to an ancient layer of organic matter embedded in the soil 15,000 years ago. So that buried organic matter tied up a lot of carbon that has been stored in the yedema permafrost all these years. As long as the permanently frozen ground stays frozen, that carbon is safe underground. But what happens if the permafrost begins to melt? Let's see the video clip that will explain a lot in much more detail what the permafrost melt means and why it's happening.
Much of the Arctic region is warming around 4 times faster than the global average, pushing another sensitive climate system towards a tipping point: permafrost. This frozen ground is estimated to contain more than 1,500 billion tons of carbon globally. This is equivalent to twice the total amount of carbon that's currently in the Earth's atmosphere, including all the human-caused CO2 and methane emissions that have already warmed the planet near 1.5 degrees. Global warming is gradually thawing this permafrost, releasing even more carbon into the atmosphere, leading to more warming and more thaw. And I think you can see the problem here. Before the 2023 fire season, no one I talked to believed that a runaway feedback loop had been triggered here. But then 45 million acres burned in Canada, more than doubling the previous annual record. Fires even burned into the Arctic Circle, leaving vast areas of permafrost unprotected and uninsulated by vegetation and more susceptible to the rising temperature.
So here we are. This is the boundary of the Hess Creek fire, and what makes it unique is that it's happened over old carbon called yedema.
Yedema is important because it's the most carbon-rich kind of permafrost. It's made of underground ice wedges and organic matter that froze during the last ice age before it had time to decompose. When Yedima thaws, the organic matter begins to decompose, releasing the stored carbon into the atmosphere. By measuring the carbon emissions from the soil here, scientists can understand the impact that fire has on the permafrost below.
Underneath us is ancient old ice age deposits, and still today they're frozen.
And is that because of the trees and all the shrubs that we see around here?
Exactly. But as soon as you strip back that ecosystem, you create disturbance, which creates a positive feedback, and that can lead to a tipping point.
But the key to understanding this tipping point lies in the Yedima's deep ice wedges. But this is kind of hard to understand from the surface because you can't see them. So we're going underground.
You can actually see that the plants are still green. The plants never had a chance to decompose. This particular spot, this material has been frozen for at least 15,000 years.
At that time, the Earth was warming as it emerged from the last ice age. This thawed the very top layer of permafrost, turning it into soil where plants and even forests were able to grow. These ecosystems then insulated the remaining Yedima permafrost below, protecting it from further thaw. But now, things are changing.
So here you can actually see the ice wedge itself. And then look above you. So the reason these ice wedges are so important is because, well, they're composed of water. And when they're frozen, this keeps everything together. But as they thaw, they can form wetlands, such as thermal karst lakes, which actually convert this carbon into methane. And methane is about 85 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2.
More on methane in a moment, but first let's focus on the lakes creating it. Water transfers heat very efficiently, so once these ice wedges begin to melt, the thaw is almost contagious and spreads quickly, creating lots of smaller local tipping points. So we're going to a different location near Fairbanks where Nick believes an irreversible tipping point has already been crossed.
So a chunk of this is just falling into the lake and these trees are falling in. But you have to realize 50 years ago, this was all a permafrost plateau that's now transitioning into a lake. And so what you'll find is a lot of methane, extreme methane emissions here, but none here. And this lake is, we believe, the largest methane emitting lake in the literature.
And lakes like this are important for two big reasons. One is that they convey heat to the surrounding permafrost, leading to the spread of further thaw and the creation of more lakes. And two, when organic matter breaks down underwater, which is what happened here, it creates methane, and methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas. So does this mean we have triggered the permafrost tipping point, releasing all that Arctic carbon into the atmosphere? I asked Tim what he thought.
When we look down from space, we see that we're crossing quite a few permafrost tipping points locally, and they are visible as these craters or pockmarks. So the big concern is that we see those tipping points escalating and it becoming a much larger scale problem, an amplifier of climate change. There are these extraordinary fires that we've seen in the last couple of years that are starting to hit and hurt the slow major carbon stores of the permafrost. We've not seen the evidence for a global methane bomb that's amplifying warming, but we are seeing these localized tipping points and we're starting to see them spread, which is an obvious sign for concern.
Permafrost melting adds methane to the atmosphere, and methane is 85 times more warming than CO2. So this is an impact on the environment. If lots of permafrost melts, it could potentially create a methane bloom or methane bomb, a massive eruption of methane into the atmosphere, raising the levels of greenhouse gases beyond our imagination. It would be runaway warming. Scientists point to the growing evidence of permafrost melt as a mandate to human beings. We must decrease fossil fuel use to curtail human-caused carbon emissions and mitigate global warming. Another environmental impact has to do with fresh water. It's already beginning to happen as more and more land between freshwater lakes turns to swamp. The freshwater lakes can collapse into rivers, running into the Arctic Sea and creating a loss of fresh water as it mixes with the saline ocean. It changes the salinity of the ocean as well and impacts the marine life there and decreases the biodiversity. Ultimately, it can change the ocean's circulation pattern, which contributes to another tipping point. It's all related. There are human impacts on from the permafrost melt. When I was traveling in Fairbanks, Alaska in 2005, I witnessed roads buckled like washboards because of the melting permafrost beneath. And repairing the roads is an exercise in futility. New asphalt doesn't change the fact that ice is melting unevenly beneath the surface, impacting transportation. When I visited Churchill, Canada, to see the plight of the polar bears hunting on an ever-decreasing ice shelf, the scientific outpost had to receive all of its supplies via small planes, braving the winter storms. Why? Because for over a year, the railroad that had been their mainstay for receiving food and medicines from the south had been unusable, as rails shifted out of alignment due to melting permafrost. Throughout western Alaska, cemeteries are becoming less stable as the permafrost melts. Isolated indigenous communities especially are impacted, another example of the uneven impact of climate change. In the coastal town of Conjuganic, sinking cemeteries prevent Alaskans from burying their dead in the ground. Permafrost impacts human beings in terms of homes and developments. I witnessed a development area in Fairbanks that had to be abandoned because of melting permafrost. People lost their investments and the developer went bankrupt, unable to build on land that they had bought and believed to be stable. Other people find their long-established homes shifting, breaking apart, sinking as the foundation beneath them liquefies. Whole villages find life impossible. Boardwalks have to be laid across swampy ground, and as buildings sink, their only option is to move. Rock and landslides and coastal erosion add to the problem. The village of Shishmaref, located on an island 5 miles from the western Alaska mainland, has eroded so much that it's contemplating total relocation. Newtok and Kivalina are among the many other villages needing to relocate. In 2003, that's 21 years ago, an official report said erosion and flooding and permafrost melt affect 86% of Alaska Native villages to some degree. Governments have attempted to help, but is it really a just transition? According to a 2022 report, the Biden administration will give money to 5 Native American tribes to help them relocate away from rivers and coastlines, away from permafrost, potentially creating a model for other communities around the country as the effects of climate change get worse. The funding will go to 3 tribes in Alaska and 2 in Washington state, and it marks the start of a new federal program specifically designed to relocate people and homes threatened by climate change. It's the first such program in American history. But the relocation awards also present a challenge to government officials who have to decide which communities get funding to retreat, and more than half the tribes that applied for the relocation program were rejected. In order for this to be a just transition, programs are also needed for Indigenous peoples in Canada, Russia, Asian and Nordic countries, And equitable ways of providing livelihoods for those who move are a must, because more than homes are at stake when a village can no longer remain on its traditional land. The melting permafrost, the collapse of freshwater lakes, and the impact on oceans affects God's creatures as well as human beings. So let's look at another example of a tipping point that begins with biodiversity. Coral reef bleaching is a well-known and well-publicized phenomenon that has been troubling scientists and environmentalists for decades. What exactly is coral bleaching? And why does it impact both marine life and human life so greatly? The PBS 2024 program mentioned previously does a good job of explaining the problem, its impact, and the imminent tipping point that we are facing.
Coral reefs are one of the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. Nearly a quarter of all marine species rely on them, as well as hundreds of millions of people that count on them for food, income, and protection from extreme storms like hurricanes. But an ocean that's too hot, by even just a couple degrees, could change everything.
Most corals are animals, but in their tissues, they have this symbiotic algae. They use energy from the sun to create foods through photosynthesis. When the temperatures get too warm, let's say a little bit above 87, 88, into the 90s, the algae actually stop being able to produce food for the corals, and instead they produce toxic chemicals.
When this happens, the coral expel the colorful algae in an attempt to save themselves.
That's the process of bleaching. Before this year, things were already pretty bleak, unfortunately. It's estimated that about half of the world's corals had been lost already due to bleaching and other things.
Like many other climate impacts, damage from bleaching is binary. Increasing heat has little impact until a threshold is crossed, then suddenly the results are catastrophic. If they remain bleached for too long, they starve and die. It takes about 8 weeks. Coral bleaching itself is nothing new, but what is new is how often these bleaching events occur, making it difficult for coral to recover in between. Too much bleaching too close together, and we lose the living corals, leading to the collapse of the reef structure where all of that biodiversity lives.
What we're seeing this year is very surprising and scary because we're seeing a 3 degrees Celsius kind of temperature anomaly.
Back in the 1960s and 70s and even into the 80s, there was roughly 30 to 60% of the reef surface was covered in living coral. Today, before this thermal event, 2 to 5% of our reef is covered in living coral.
Bleaching was everywhere, and this was the case for every reef that we went to. Fish were still using the features, but if the reef-building coral have trouble recovering, the structure will eventually fall apart.
On the bottom, it was fluctuating between 91 and 92 degrees Fahrenheit. And then at the surface, there were definitely a couple of spots where we hit 93. That's incredibly hot. Coral after coral after coral that are bleached. I would estimate something much greater than 90% of the corals down there on this relatively high coral cover site were showing some signs of bleaching, all the way through completely bleached, and then a much lower proportion are obviously already dead. So all of that bleaching is just over the last couple of weeks.
By the winter of 2023, water temperatures in Florida had dropped, so we met up with Liv to get a sense of how much of the coral survived. In the water, it was clear right away that the heat event was just too long and too intense for most of the reef to survive. The bleached coral we saw earlier in the summer was no longer stark white. It was brown, gray, and dead.
I really fear that we may have reached, something of a tipping point with these elkhorn and staghorn coral populations because they're just so depleted that, there's just not that many of them left to work with.
As 2023 turned to 2024 and waters cooled in Florida and warmed in the southern hemisphere, authorities officially declared the fourth and most severe global bleaching event in recorded history. In general, corals in the Indo-Pacific region have fared much better than those in the Caribbean because there are fewer human-caused stressors and higher biodiversity. Still, 2024 was the fifth mass bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef in just 8 years. And global sea surface temperatures in 2024 are breaking the shocking records of 2023. The single most important factor in whether or not we reach a global tipping point for coral is the frequency of bleaching events. So, is it possible this threshold has already been crossed?
I think we tragically have crossed a tipping point for coral reefs. We've seen the fourth great bleaching event for the reefs. I thought it was going to take us a decade to be sure that we'd passed the tipping point or not for the corals. We're now having 12 months of 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. I think it's given us pretty clear evidence that big areas of coral reef are past their tipping point now.
So let's look at some of the characteristics of the coral reef tipping point. Items that push the coral reef system toward a tipping point include not only the heat waves from ocean warming, but also hurricanes, disease factors, and overexploitation by humans. These stressors destabilize and threaten the living corals, and they can suddenly tip the whole reef population from a healthy, stable state to a degraded coral reef that deteriorates and breaks apart. When we take measures to minimize those stresses, it builds resilience and gives the corals a chance to recover. Coral reefs impact marine life. You saw in the video how many species are dependent on the coral reefs for food, for shelter from predators, and for homes that are safe from stormy currents. Coral reefs underpin ocean biodiversity globally. They contain the highest number of species of any ecosystem besides rainforests. They're home to about 25% of all marine species. They provide nutrients, they fix carbon and nitrogen, and they provide water filtration. Coral reefs are a carbon store in the calcium carbonate skeletons of the animals. They contribute to the carbon cycle by helping global warming. They also have an impact on coastlines. They protect coastlines from waves and tropical storms by reducing wave energy, reducing wave heights, decreasing associated erosion and storm damage. And as the sea level rises, the impact is even more important. The coral reefs must be maintained to protect the coastlines. How does it impact human beings? It's estimated that it supports over 500 million to 1 billion people by providing food, income, and coastal protection. And different studies have come up with different numbers there. Food security for vulnerable populations is dependent on the protein and of coral reefs, and livelihood of 6 million small-scale reef fishers is dependent on coral reefs. Now, that's not the corporate fishers. That's the small-scale reef fishers. The reefs contribute over $375 billion up to $2.77 trillion a year in goods and services, including tourism and recreation. There are raw materials for life-saving medicines that are found in coral reefs to promote the investigation and creation of antiviral drugs and anti-cancer drugs. So when we talk about a just transition, overfishing, especially by large commercial enterprises, disrupts the balance around coral reefs. Even recreational fishing can damage that balance. Reef systems can quickly collapse. The fish stocks that depend on the reefs can in turn collapse. So sustainable fishing practices have to be in place to ensure that coral reefs, humans, and sea life can all thrive. There are actions that we can take to support a just transition. We're not talking about stopping every single fisherman who gets a fish off of a coral reef. That would not be just. But you can educate yourself on local fishing rules and regulations, and your state fishery agency or bait and tackle shop can help you learn more about local rules. If you are fishing, take only what you need. Catch and release fish that you don't plan to eat. Make sustainable seafood choices. It will begin to impact the fishing industry gradually, slowly. Fishermen can adjust. You can learn more at www.fishwatch.gov. Support sustainable income-generating activities such as aquaculture and responsible tourism as an alternative to coral reef fishing. And you can learn about and support marine protected areas and locally managed marine areas in collaboration with governments and communities. Support one of the creditable organizations working to save coral reefs and replant threatened coral species such as Coral Reef Alliance. There is hope for the future of coral reefs. British scientists have selectively bred coral to tolerate warmer seas for the first time, offering ecosystems on barrier reefs around the world a glimmer of hope. The scientists focused on 150 wild colonies of coral, which contained thousands of polyps and were transplanted to a tank. They identified those best adapted to deal with warmer conditions and moved them to an aquarium where they could grow. And eventually they were set to breed where they could release their eggs and sperm in the ocean. The results show it's possible to improve coral's tolerance to short, intense heat exposure. And the British study is not the only one that has started this method of preserving corals. A just transition to the future is possible if we marshal the energy and the resources to affect how global warming and carbon emissions progress. We are approaching tipping points on multiple facets of environmental issues. And if we can motivate mass political progress has occurred and will continue to occur in many nations, if not all. Even where top leaders seem impervious to the dangers of global warming, or even take measures to litigate against it, great change can be effected at the local level through local governments, pressures on industry, and divesting from fossil fuel giants. It is at the local area that codes are put in place, buildings are affected, where decisions can be made that can help move the world across the peak of global warming and down the side towards zero loss of nature, sustainable food systems, zero carbon energy, and circular economies. Technological disruptions are rendering fossil fuel technology obsolete and costly, and also creating new possibilities for carbon capture, hydrogen fuel, and imaginative solutions. Market forces have begun driving the increase in investment and in employment to support electric vehicles, green energy sources, and new innovations in batteries, fuel, and waste management. A just transition to the future is possible if we make responsible choices.
Thank you, Susan. We're going to have a brief period now of discussion, questions, and answers. And I might note that there's been kind of an interesting dialogue going on in the chat about, the various kinds of actions that we might consider taking in order to begin to reduce carbon and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And I guess just to uh, comment on that discussion going on, it's not about whether or not these tipping points are occurring or the urgency of the situation. It's really a discussion in the chat about, so what do we do about it? And the discussion is talking about whether we should be focusing on fossil fuel reduction or changes in our agricultural practices and other kinds of efforts. And so I guess I'd just like to comment that I don't think it's a serial process. It's not taking one thing at a time in order and working on what seems to be the most effective. This is what we call a parallel effort that needs to happen across the board. We can all have discussions about how to approach different strategies. But right now, we're going to look for people who might want to weigh in on the discussion, have a question, particularly about all of this very intense information that you've just viewed. And then let you ask your questions. Those who are present will try to answer. And if you have comments, please let us know as well. And so please raise your hand, in the using the tool at the bottom of your screen under where the heart is, it says react. And you can click the button that says raise your hand, and that will move you to the sort of the head of the line on the screen. And so we'll be able to see you being ready to ask a question or make a comment. Anyone who is particularly eager to voice your comments or your question. I guess I'm going to ask Dakota if he'd like to just quickly summarize the points he's been making in chat while we're looking for people who have questions or comments.
Okay, hi everybody. Yeah, I love talking about things like planting trees and things that basically kind of halt emissions and also draw down carbon and methane that's already, trapped in the atmosphere. Because it just seems like we're at these tipping points. It's such a, it's like we have this five alarm fire going on the planet, and it's always, yeah, it's not easy topics, but just like was mentioned about, a lot of times things come up about, oh, if we have to change current practices in our world, it always is some discomfort involved, and there might be job changes, of course, and things like that, whatever sector it might be in. But I'm really glad that we are talking about this, because it just takes because if we don't, we're not going to go anywhere but, worse, So, but yeah, it's like even if jobs in the animal agriculture sector change, or also in the fossil fuel sector, it's not that people are going to not have a livelihood. I mean, we just create different jobs, jobs that nurture the planet, jobs that, reduce the things that we're currently doing to add to the problem. And so instead of adding fuel to the fire, we actually put water on the fire. So but the thing I always want to talk about the animal agriculture side is because I learned that it's actually a lot more of a problem than has been shared with us in mainstream media. And even the IPCC has not divulged honestly the accounting. And what I mean is, well, there's a paper. In fact, it's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And I just am involved in a climate team that I've been able to see this letter, but the paper isn't public yet. But it's going to be
So
soon.
Dakota, is there a link you could put in the chat? We're only got about 3 more minutes before we move to the next item. But thank you for those observations. And I think it's healthy for us to be getting into these dialogues, and good for you for doing your research. Other comments or questions? Well, I think maybe this is a cue to us that we should move into the next section because it's a breather to help us just relax a bit and contemplate all that we've heard, which has obviously been an intense set of facts and information. So, Lori, I'm going to turn it to you for us to start in the breather section.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just take a quick note that we just, between Susan and I, we just put some further resources if you want to dive more deeply into the tipping points that we've been talking about today. So there's a recent report that just came out that begins a state of climate report. We are on the brink of an irreversible climate disaster. We've been talking about that, but we've also been talking about, it concludes, we need bold transformative changes. And that's really what today and what these next series of webinars are going to be about. So, our breather. Here we are. For many of us, it really does feel as if we're standing on a crumbling cliff at the edge of a yawning abyss. For a lot of people, the world seems to be falling apart. Climate catastrophes multiply, irreversible tipping points are looming, all creation groans. And our governments are either unwilling to provide bold leadership or choose blind denial or take steps that are just too small. So it's also true that we humans are making choices too often based on self-interest. I'm going to point my fingers this way rather than always remembering the common good. So it feels lonely and scary in this dark midnight full of snake-ridden nightmares as we grope for hope. So we want to take this chance to breathe together and receive again the words of our poem, our signature poem that we have considered often during this series, A Bridge of Hope.
When we come to the abyss, snakes, fire, midnight, hole, nightmares, whatever down below, we know we must sing the old refrain of hope. It is only by singing out we are heard. It is the raising of the voice that changes the singer. We must be brave enough to be changed. For in the speaking, we are changed. In the trying to name, we are discovered. It is the taking of the step that calls. It is the taking of the step that calls the earth to rise to meet it. What needs to be found can only be built stone by stone, pebble by pebble, hope by hope, word by word. Many speakers, many singers, many builders, waiting to be told what to do. But what is needed has never been done before. We all must be the blind leaders in the dark, mouths dry and singing prayers off key. Our hands full of dust and pebbles and our grandmother's seeds. Be the mad woman leading the way. Trust your love, and trust this path will change you. Trust others will join you. The only way off this crumbling cliff is to build this bridge. As you go every day to the edge of what you know of yourself, and then go beyond. There you will find others singing a familiar song, becoming a new way together. There will be no name for this new place until long after we are gone. But you feel it calling you, praying you into being. Go fly. Do it now. I will join you.
As I've revisited this poem, I keep asking, what is being asked of me in these days that seem so difficult? What's being asked of us? And the words in the poem, resonant and bold, that sing their way into my heart first are these: we must be brave enough to be changed. The poem doesn't say change yourself, as if all by my lonely self, and if I just tried hard enough, I could conjure enough power to get the world I want. No. The poem insists and invites that we need to be brave enough to be changed, to be bold enough to allow ourselves to be transformed into something altogether new. And if transformed, by who, into what, and how? What we need in these days is the kind of hope that summons courage. Not a pallid, timid kind of hope that wilts when we don't get the outcomes we want. No. We need the fierce kind of hope that refuses denial on one side or fatalistic despair on the other. We need the kind of hope that fearlessly trusts the interwoven essence of life itself, this web of beings, interconnected and fragile. We need the kind of hope that inspires resilience, responsible choices, and bold actions that we can take together.
We are faced with hard choices at every level of our lives and in every arena. Do we grasp for more indulgent comfort, more trivial convenience, more redundant travel experiences at the expense of our neighbors, the strangers in the next town, the state, nation, culture, or religion? Or do we make decisions that regulate our own desires, serving instead the common good of all living beings and the planet that sustains us? In the welfare of others lies our own welfare. Our threatened planetary future calls us to make those good choices now, to avoid more draconian choices made for us by the course of events beyond those planetary tipping points. We can pay now, or we will pay later. Listen to the mad woman, grandmother, calling us to become new.
Can you feel it? There's a yearning for a just and sustainable future that's stirring among us. The vision of God's peaceable kingdom is beckoning. A bridge, not just a transition from where we are now to the unseen place ahead, but a just transition that leaves no one behind, needs building. So maybe the cliff is crumbling beneath our feet, so we can't go back. We can only go forward. Maybe things are falling apart, so we can get down to bedrock, find a place solid enough to anchor this bridge to a sustainable future. And it was suggested this week, and I just wanted to share this. Could our enduring principles be part of that strong foundation? We have to get there. Maybe we are called to gather the stones and the pebbles and start creating new lifeways together now. Not all at once, but fragment by fragment, like a mosaic, rearranging all these old habits of oppression and exploitation into new patterns of life-reverencing relationship, God's new creation rising out of the dusty rubble. What are the stones and the pebbles, the gifts and the promises that you bring?
Wait. Our hands full of dust and pebbles and our grandmother's seeds. Do not forget the seeds, preserved by the toil of many grandmothers and by our Mother Earth. But we must choose to reverse the destruction of those other forms of life on which we so much depend on for our own survival. We can't move forward without the grandmother's seeds. Don't get lost in the abstraction of the poem. For me, every time I read it, I experience it more viscerally, in my bones, in my soul. I feel the seeds germinating in the earth and in me, in my garden, with my neighbors, and in my children. I feel the urgency of sustainable life.
So, even if I or we will not live to see that is barely envisioned and unnamed, still, I know I want to give what's left of my life to what has never been done before. Not for me, but for the generations to come. The work is worth it. A just transition is a bridge to a sustainable future that we can't imagine, but that we know is potent with promise. What if my heart will only be made whole building that bridge? What must I dare? So the poet lures me back to the abyss, and she says, go every day to the edge. Go every day to the edge of what you know of yourself. Every day. And then go beyond. And there you will find others becoming a new way together. So is it possible that when I finally summon the courage to take the plunge into my broken heart right now, that I will find you, each of you, on the other side? That you will be there singing this new song with fierce and fearless hope? Will life itself be there ahead of us, composing this symphonic chorus of flourishing? Will we discover in each other the potent and blessed power of community? No longer alone, I can breathe again. Let us become a new way together.
Over to you, Andrew.
Oh.
Thanks, Laurie. Even when we make the responsible choices needed to slow the effects of climate change by turning towards renewables and away from fossil fuels, we expect the transition will not be easy. There will be vulnerable people and communities who could suffer as we transition to a low or no carbon future. These people and communities will need protecting, and this process we call a just transition. We, along with other climate groups, are campaigning for a just transition. You're going to hear a lot about just transitions, especially as it features in our proposed World Church resolution. A just transition needs three parts to make it effective: anticipation, participation, and support. Anticipation of negative impacts through long-term planning and through impact assessments to foresee and address negative impacts and let people adapt by gradual transition. Participation of workers and communities in planning and advancing climate actions, and support through targeted financial programs and capacity building that prioritize the most vulnerable. We know that many professions, industries, and communities will face hardship as we close down coal mines, as we shut down oil wells, as we stop burning coal, wood pellets, and plastic waste to create energy. We know that a third of all shipping will no longer be needed when we stop using oil and gas. We know that poorer communities can't afford EVs or heat pumps, and some industries like farming will struggle to afford electric and hydrogen-powered machinery that isn't even invented yet. All of these industries need our support, and need the support, finance, and retraining, and this process we call a just transition. Over the next few webinars, I'll be bringing you some good news stories and examples of what just transition looks like. And each will use these three key initiatives of anticipation, participation, and support. My first story comes from Spain in 2018, when 10 coal mines faced closure and the loss of 1,000 jobs as the country transitioned to a low carbon economy. This just transition brought together the government, businesses, unions, and $280 million equivalent was put aside to support early retirement for workers over the age of 48, and to help other workers retrain and transition to clean energy initiatives and green jobs. Unions hailed the mining deal, which covers Spain's privately owned pits, as a model agreement. Teresa Ribera, the Minister for Ecological Transition, said, "With this agreement, we have solved the first urgent task we had when we came to government. Our aim has been to leave no one behind. We also want to go further. We want to innovate. That is why we offer the drawing up of just transitional contracts, with the aim of helping the regions to consolidate the employment of the future. Spain can now export this deal as an example of good practice," she said. "We have shown that it's possible to follow the Paris Agreement without damage to people's livelihoods. We don't need to choose between a job and protecting the environment. It is possible to have both." A just transition supports workers and industry as industry converts to a low carbon economy. My second story today is local to me. I live not far from Radcliffe-on-Soar power station, and there were several other coal-fired power stations along the same river. I remember that often gas and vapour filled the sky over South Derbyshire, where I live. The Radcliffe-on-Soar power station was the UK's last coal-fired electricity generator, due to be closed a year ago, but it was kept open to ensure energy security after the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, and eventually closed just a month ago, ending over 100 years of burning coal to create electricity in the UK. In itself, this is a moment to celebrate. In the last few years, the power station employees have been offered support, training, and finance so they can transition to new sustainable industries and green jobs. This landmark moment comes as the UK becomes the first major economy to officially phase out coal power, a significant and transformative step in the global fight against climate change. The closure of Radcliffe-on-Soar plant, a staple of Britain's energy infrastructure for over 5 decades, represents not just the end of coal power, but a clear shift towards greener, more sustainable energy future. And as for the site, well, Radcliffe-on-Soar Power Station has received local development order planning permission status that could fast-track new investment, green industry, and business projects, and potentially create thousands of permanently high-skilled jobs. This will increase the speed in which the planning process are progressed for a range of modern industry uses, and the vision for the site sets out guiding principles by which any development could be brought forward, to include possibly a zero carbon technology energy hub for the East Midlands, highly skilled, well-paid jobs, modern industry businesses uses, served by on-site sustainable energy generation and storage, a hub for research, development, and innovation through links with universities, business support organisations, and established industry. The leader of the local council, Councillor Neil Clark, MBE, said, "We look forward to working together with Uniper and the relevant partners of the East Midlands Freeport and Development Corporation on projects to realise the vision of the site with international investment that could create an estimated 7,000 jobs." As the UK and all countries pivots away from fossil fuels, governments are keen to ensure that a just transition to green jobs benefits regions traditionally dependent on heavy industry, such as the North Sea. But that's a story for another webinar. A just transition protects fossil fuel employees. So, Dean, do we have any time for questions?
I've just been monitoring the chat. There have been a few more comments just about what are the strategies we all ought to employ. Does anyone have any examples, such as Andrew has just given, that they're aware of, where particularly local efforts have begun to do the hard work of moving away from fossil fuels and other CO2 emitting industries in a just and a fair way? Any questions that you have of the stories that Andrew has shared with us? Everybody just overwhelmed by the reality of it all. I want to mention that while I'm looking for any questions or comments, that in the chat, Lori and others have put in some links to, among other things, the video series that we've drawn our sample video snippets from. And then Galen has put in a link to another study that talks about the contribution to greenhouse gases from agricultural industries. Lori?
Yeah, I just want to make one add really quickly that even as we are considering just transition and focusing on our industrialized countries where the transition needs to happen, we are also not losing sight of the way in which these choices impact people in countries that are far beyond our immediate awareness, that we're wanting to be aware of justice issues around the world, as well as for those who are most immediately impacted in the fossil fuel transition, as well as, you'll expect this from me, remembering the way in which these choices we're calling each other to make also impact biodiversity and other creatures who aren't even human. So I just want to make sure that as we go forward, we remember that we're holding all of the world and all of life that needs to flourish, and even as these things that are have to do with the way we live our lives are our most immediate place for action, if that makes sense.
Alice?
You stated that Spain and Ukraine, the UK, are phasing out coal power. Are they working towards a zero emissions? Both these countries?
So Spain and the UK, yeah, yes, they are. Spain gets a lot of solar power. They've really focused on solar power. So we can see a lot more from them. They're also exporting their solar power to places like the UK. So yes, we are trying our best. We've had some great initiatives since our new government came in to try to increase the amount of renewables. In fact, I just heard today that the governments in Scotland and Britain are working together, and they've come up with a plan to spend about 60 million on renewables in Scotland. So that's a really good thing. That will triple the amount of wind that we have at the moment. So yeah, great stuff is happening.
Would they be, I mean, couldn't we learn from these other countries to help encourage our congressmen to find out what the other countries are doing?
I really hope so. Thank you, Alice.
Joan? Joan? Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether this is a question or a comment. It's a question, but I think it's a comment because I don't expect anybody to have the answer for this. But when we first started the series, Dr. Gammon talked about a plan for us to reduce our personal carbon footprints by saying, okay, in the first decade, reduce 50%, and then in the second decade, reduce another 50% of what's remaining, and then the third decade, reduce another 50% of what's reduced. And that would get us to where we need to be by 2050. But it sounds to me that everything is accelerating so much faster than anticipated that we no longer have the time to do that nice, easy kind of reduction of fossil fuels. So I'm not expecting anybody to have the answer to this, but I just wonder how we realistically do that faster reduction for those of us, who are privileged enough to be able to do it, even though it might pinch and hurt somewhat. It's not going to get us out on the street or anything. Looks like Susan wants to answer that.
I can't answer it, Joan. What I can do is add a comment. And that is that as I did the research on tipping points, over and over and over, I came across the comments from scientists globally that everything has accelerated faster than expected, just as you said, that things are moving toward a crisis quicker than we expected it to. And they are no longer having a target of 2050. They're now saying that many scientists are now pointing to 2030, only 5 years away, as a time when, if we don't do something in the next 5 years, we could be passing many of the tipping points that were on Tim Linton's list. And that is difficult. Now, I also want to caution you that the media picks up on stuff and they like to fearmonger. And so be cautious as you read stuff in the media, do the research and find out how well researched and how well founded some of those things are. The research I've done seems to indicate that 2030 is going to be a critical goal for us, and we need to do something much more drastically by 2030. And how we do that, I do not know, Joan, but that's what they're saying. But just to mention, like, for instance, somebody mentioned the plankton in the chats, and there has been a big foo-for-ah about a study that indicated 90% of the plankton had already died in the ocean. Trust me, if that had happened, we would know it. We would all be feeling it already. And that has not happened. And the difficulty is that not only was that study misreported and misinterpreted and picked up by the media to promote that falsehood, but then afterwards, the media reversed and began saying, scientists are wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. 90% of the plankton is not dead. There's studies that show that that was an isolated little spot of only one type, and here's why, and all of that. And they are, as a result, they blast the scientists as not knowing what they're talking about. And it hurts us a whole lot more than it should from one falsely reported study. So do your research, do the checking, find out if what is being reported, especially the crisis issues that are brought by the media, do the research and find out if it's really as bad as they think it is. With the tipping points, I actually was reassured that some of them are not as bad as we thought. They are progressing and we do need to pay attention. But then there are ones like the coral where we may be in trouble, and we're working hard, we're fighting to protect that coral and to figure out what to do about the permafrost, which is a new one that people are stunned by and trying to manage. Anyway.
So we're just a minute away from our end time, and I see people with hands raised. I think I'm going to ask that you hold your questions and come back to our next webinar, or put your comments in the chat quickly for people to see. And I'm going to hand it over to Rod to close us out.
Yes, thanks, Dean, and thanks everybody. Yes, I love some of the stuff in the chat, some great ideas, and we'll be further exploring this. I think it's clear. I got the sense people feel that that these are the types of issues that we must face, that people of prophetic courage must face up to. And that's what we have going for us, is that sense of prophetic courage and that sense of God's good spirit that someday shall prevail. And with that, I will simply let you know there will be no session in December, simply because it's Christmas and I'm sure you're all busy getting Advent in your churches and things like that. So stay tuned for our January through April, or actually May series before World Conference. We'll be announcing that as soon as we've got that settled. So thank you all for coming and being part of this presentation, and we'll hope to see you next time. So with that, I will stop the recording, and I will let you unmute yourselves, say your goodbyes, and hope to see you next time. Thanks for coming, everyone.
That's it.